Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers podcast. Hello once more and welcome back. Welcome back to the tiny corner of the internet that I like to call the Scandal Sphere. And here I am, the beating heart of Scandal Centre, scandalous Australian bar behind me as usual. A bottle of Japanese gin, fancy Japanese gin. I'm just thinking maybe somebody's watching this, bit of product placement. I'm open to all offers, gin manufacturers, anybody really. What a week, lots to talk about, really good interview coming up. Simon Heffer, one of Britain's most distinguished historians. I guess what you might call an establishment historian. Maybe that's not fair. A conservative, I think that is fair. Terrific access, though. Amazing access to the powers that be. Really good on the royal family. And he's going to talk to me soon all about the abdication crisis, which is probably the greatest royal scandal of them all. Got invited to a party. I'm so excited. Sarah Lodge last week. Thank you for all who watched Sarah or listened. What a lovely person. It was so interesting to talk to her about the Victorian detectives. She's invited me to the launch party of her book, and I am childishly excited. I haven't been to a literary launch party for ages. I thought they'd died out. Anyway, I shall be going into central London, somewhere nice, next week. I'll take lots of pictures and put them on Twitter. So that's very exciting, for me at least. Yeah, Phil's only in it for the freebies. Actually, I'm going to talk about freebies in a little while. But first, what to say? Loads of feedback. Love to talk about the feedback. A very nice email, excuse me, very nice email from our friend Karen Anderson from Maryland, saying how much she enjoyed Sarah and her story of female detectives. Please give us more episodes that help fill in the lost histories of women, she says. Well, I think I will. On YouTube, a wonderfully complicated name, Atcha CK7PD. Atcha, if you're listening. What a lovely comment. Thank you. Atcha says, he or she, this has been my favourite podcast ever since I discovered it. Probably because I'm a social historian with a taste for scandal. What good guests, fascinating guests, and good topics. Boy, do you deserve more listeners. Do you think I deserve more listeners? Spread the word if you can, because I wouldn't mind a few more. Rislin Jones. I think Rislin's commented before, actually. Hello, Rislin. Rislin Jones 5817. Says, I like that you're fair and a gentleman, Phil. Isn't that nice? Don't ever become jaundiced like the other podcasters. Boo hiss all the other podcasters. Those other podcasters who can't rise above the BS. What can she mean? Yes, well, that's lovely. I like to think I can rise above that sort of thing. What a lovely comment. Thank you. What else? Oh, yes, Wildflowers 516. I think I've not heard from you before. Hey, Phil, enjoyed hearing your thoughts. I used to like Harry. I know where this is going. After he showed the world his true self, though I don't respect him and I don't care really to support his endeavours. He doesn't want to be part of the institution and he shouldn't come back. I think that's what you're saying. That's a précis. But what I like is people don't necessarily agree with me on stuff. And anyway, to be honest, on Harry, I'm a little bit 50-50, as I hope you know. But I do see some positive things in him, which doesn't always agree. People don't always agree with me on that. But Wildflower 516 says, but anyway, what a lovely guest. I enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to seeing you chat with Shauna. Yes, so Shauna and I, that's Shauna from the Vintage Read, we're becoming great internet mates, best buddies. She has an open invitation to the bar if she can get herself on a plane. Yes, Shauna and I will be talking about Fired, and that's going out on Monday, which will be Monday the Check's Diary, Monday the 14th, a day after this podcast goes out. So we're doing like a whole hour or 50 minutes or so going into Fired in great detail. And I've gone back to my files for my Diana biography, and I found lots of things that at the time didn't seem particularly interesting. I didn't put them in the book because my focus wasn't really on him. So I'm going to talk about that because some of it is very, very quite fascinating and suggests new angles. But I'm not going to talk about that today because I'm saving that up for Shauna. But Fired has been in the news this week. Another 50, 60, or is it, maybe I think it's 65 women have contacted the BBC. And these allegations are not just about Harrods. They stretch back to the 70s when he was first making his way in Britain. They include people who worked for him in his big house down in Surrey, not too far from where I'm sitting, a place called Oxted, where we used to take our kids for walks. Lots of nice big houses down there. But people are talking about harassment, sexual assault, and more rape allegations emerging. The BBC show The Predator at Harrods really is worth watching. I know it's perhaps the instinct of some people to think, well, why are all these women only talking now? And who knows, some of them might be just jumping on a bandwagon. You can't discount that. But, a lot of this, and that's what's really telling, a lot of this doesn't just happen now, hasn't just happened now. People have been talking about this for a long time, complaining about it, even going to the police about it, and nothing was done. So it is really bubbling up to one of the all-time great scandals, I think, with the makings of being a second Weinstein. But enough from me on that today. I'm going to talk to Shauna more about it tomorrow. Anyway, so the part of the show where I give you my views about the state of the world, or as my kids say, Phil going on about stuff, Dad going on about stuff, or even Phil gets on his soapbox. Here's a clue. It's what's going to happen. Not a box. You can't buy soap in boxes anymore, can you? But anyway, soapbox alert. You can always skip the interview. But I want to talk about freebies because, and the whole subject of scandal in British politics, so this is called the Scandal Mongers podcast. We did a show about Boris Johnson a little while ago. It's really defined politics in Britain. Okay, is that an exaggeration? I'd say it's driven change. It really has. The idea of scandal and unearthing scandals. The Conservative Party came into power under Boris Johnson with a massive majority. He was really popular. People just sort of bought into his sort of slightly buffoonish, but very bouncy and very positive take on the world. And he seemed like a man who could get things done, whether you were a Tory or you weren't a Tory. A lot of people who were lifelong Labour voters actually voted for him in 2019. But scandal really defined his premiership, or the reasons why his premiership became unravelled. He seemed to rule over a very chaotic administration, especially at the heart of government. There were endless vendettas, briefings, people were slamming doors, people were being fired. There were, faction fighting was kind of breaking out in the open. And he had a very kind of loose approach to the rules. I mean, all his life he had, and he sort of got away with it. But there were stories about him getting donations, not declaring them properly, people getting favors. People who had caught up in misbehavior, he would defend them when normally you probably wouldn't. MPs with wandering hands, to put it mildly. He sort of jumped to their defense. His own MPs became exasperated with him, and he seemed to rule over a kind of realm of chaos. I mean, COVID was a lot of his time, and one can perhaps make some, he can explain some of it away by the pressure that all governments around the world were under at that time. But he did seem to get into a particularly kind of chaotic state. And then, of course, there's this thing called Partygate, which was probably the biggest thing. And it offended a lot of people, and rightly so, because we were all expected to play by the rules, and the rules were really strict here. What you could do, who you could meet with, who could go to see people in hospital or to the funerals of their loved ones, and touched on my family too. And then it was revealed that there'd been all these parties in Number 10 and at the heart of government. Now, Johnson himself, to be honest, didn't go to that many of them. I mean, you could argue he didn't go to any of them, actually, because the only fine he got, because there was an inquiry, he got a fine, was for attending this sort of lunch event where somebody brought some cake. It was his birthday. It didn't look like a party. It wasn't really a party, but it was technically, it seems, in breach of the rules. But he set the tone, and he clearly was involved with drinking in Number 10. There are photographs of him going into officers, sort of leaving dues, raising a glass. Was that event in breach of the rules? It's never been quite clear. Some of them clearly were. There were some late night parties, which he wasn't at, where terrible things happened, karaoke machines, people being sick on the carpet. And this was profoundly offensive to people who had themselves not been allowed to do that or been fined. I mean, it was a criminal matter. You could get into a lot of trouble for doing some of the things that were done at Number 10 Downing Street. And even if Johnson didn't partake personally in all of them, he definitely set the tone. And then, of course, he lied about it. He obfuscated, whatever the political word is. And he was caught out for that by his peers in Parliament, some of them Conservatives, and he had to go. And I think that was fair. And now there's an inquiry, and a lot of this is coming out. He was warned about this. Famous advisor Dominic Cummings had troubles of his own during COVID, but he warned Johnson, said some of these events shouldn't happen. We should not have alcohol in the building. I just think if they'd just done that, if they said for the duration of this unprecedented health emergency, when we are expecting people not to socialise, we won't have alcohol in number 10. But it's not very Boris Johnson, is it, to say that? But that could have saved him. And he wouldn't listen to those advice. There was a gathering in the garden. People wrote messages. Is this really right? Should we be doing this? Oh, it's kind of within the rules. Well, is it? Oh, we're not sure. You know, if you're expecting people to accept very, very draconian regulations, you have to be absolutely strict with yourself. And I'm afraid self-control was never one of Boris Johnson's strong points. So yes, so he went, but the Labour Party came into power. I voted Labour for the first time in, I don't know, I couldn't vote for the previous leader, Corbyn. So I voted Labour with some hope, still have some hope, but it's been a pretty dismal beginning, I have to be honest. And again, the subject of scandal and rule breaking has reared its ugly head. And Labour made a lot out of Johnson's behaviour. Keir Starmer came across as a very preachy, rather sanctimonious, finger-wagging leader of the opposition and promised that his government would be different. Well, it hasn't been. Nothing perhaps on the scale of Partygate, because we're not living in COVID anymore, but just a number of really sort of disreputable things, taking favours, taking money, taking gifts, suits, £20,000 of free clothing for a Prime Minister who's paid quite a lot of money and is himself independently wealthy through his job as a top British lawyer. Why would you take all that? Why would you do it? Free suits, free glasses, free tickets to sporting events. You know, looks like half the cabinet went to see Taylor Swift for nothing. You know, it's not Watergate, but it doesn't look good. And it particularly doesn't look good because the man who's providing most of these favours, a sort of British media tycoon called Lord Ali, has a slightly dodgy history himself, which is coming out. He's the sort of man who doesn't declare interests, it seems. He's under investigation for not declaring his interests in some business in a tax haven in the Caribbean, in the British Virgin Islands. Is this the man you want to be taking favours from? And he was given a pass to number 10 as well, in the middle of all this. Looks wrong, looks bad. Turns out also he has done these personal diplomatic missions, not during the Starmer government, but before. 10 years ago, he was going to see President Assad of Syria and was one of those arguing that we should go easy on Assad, so it's alleged. Now, the Labour Party at that time, 2013, under Ed Miliband, they voted not to punish, not to enforce the red line on chemical weapons against Assad. And that was one of the reasons why nothing was done by Britain under Cameron and America under Obama. And people may have different views about this, but I think it was a diplomatic disaster myself. Think of the year 2013. Because we didn't act on Assad, the Iranians were empowered, the Russians were empowered. Soon we had barrel bombs on Aleppo. Terrible, terrible civilian suffering. The democracy movement was crushed. ISIS got a hold. They were already there. It's a horrible civil war, massive refugee flows. Putin got his fingers and his air force into Iran, knowing the West was going to do nothing. And guess what? The next year he went into Crimea because it was a massive sign of weakness. Would Crimea have happened? Would it have done? Had the West been stronger then? I don't know. But it was a turning point, a sliding doors moment. And this man, Lord Ali, in some way played a role in this, it seems. Maybe just lobbying. But I don't like the idea that the new Labour government, the one I voted for, is taking free clothes and rent-free use of his penthouse flats and his holiday homes in Manhattan. I don't like the idea that the government I voted for is taking favours from a man who was helping Assad. I think it's wrong. Okay. Soapbox over. I just think scandal's interesting. And I do think, I think there's a kind of, it's actually easy, I think now, easier perhaps than it used to be to expose these things because of social media. I remember Tony Blair who was a prime minister I did admire most of the time. He spoke about when he negotiated the Good Friday Agreement, which brought peace to Northern Ireland. Hugely important thing. Massive amounts of help from the Americans, from President Clinton, and some very impressive Irish politicians were able to kind of bridge this awful divide and try and build just some trust between communities that have been at war with each other. And he said he didn't think, Blair said he didn't think that he would be able to do it quite so easily now in the age of social media, because everything gets leaked and then spun and very quickly goes around the world in its most exaggerated form. And he said that to conclude that kind of peace negotiation, you need, what's the word he said? Strategic ambiguity, which is telling small lies to one side and more small lies to another side to help them kind of come together. And yeah, so social media means the business of government gets harder, and it's probably easier to oppose. You know, the Tories were torn down because of this stuff. And now Labour's getting a taste of it. A lot of people have wondered why our former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak called the election so early. He didn't need to. He might have done better if he'd waited. The economy has ticked up a little bit since he called it, for example. But I think maybe one reason he was just fed up. It's more fun to oppose. It's easier. And I think what we see on social media makes it easier. Yeah, that's me. That's my thoughts on the way things are going, on scandal, on British politics. But Simon Heffer, yes, let's talk to Simon, because for those who don't know, and I'm sure many of you will, the abdication crisis was one of the greatest shocks that's ever happened in the history of the British royal family. A new king. It's revealed only very slowly, actually. It's revealed outside Britain. This is an age where the British press don't necessarily print scandals involving the royals, but the foreign press do with great enthusiasm. So it's revealed slowly he's having this relationship with this American divorcee. He's called Wallis Simpson, and he wants to have her by his side in his new royal life. And the scene is set for one of the all-time great sort of constitutional and royal meltdowns. And I think I should let Simon take up the story. Thank you for listening. I'll see you again at the end of Simon's interview. Bye. Welcome, Simon. Thank you very much for joining me. I've got my crib sheet next to me here.
Right.
Can you see it? Your own fine book. Yes, it's the third volume of Simon's History of Britain between, well, I guess the end of Victoria and the beginning of George VI.
It's the fourth volume.
It's the fourth volume.
Yes, there's Hind Minds, The Age of Decadence, Staring at God, and Sing As We Go.
Well, I really wanted to talk to you about the abdication crisis today, but it's interesting to me to think about the year of the abdication crisis, 36, and it seems to me that so many of the things we associate with that decade all seem to happen in that year. Civil War, Cable Street riots, Jarrow Hunger March. I mean, it's a very dramatic year.
Three Kings, the Berlin Olympics. Roosevelt wins his second term in America. It's a very big year, not just in British politics, but internationally. It's also the election of the first socialist government in French history. And that changes things quite dramatically, because there's a real fear of a right-wing coup in France, which might have changed the whole direction of the Second World War if it had happened. So yeah, it's a very big year.
And in the middle of this big year, there is this unprecedented royal scandal, crisis, constitutional crisis. George V doesn't get much attention these days, but when you think about the years he was king, the stability, the steadiness, that world, as you evoke it, of a man who was excited by collecting stamps and shooting birds and, carved mahogany. His steadiness seemed to represent something, and then suddenly it was gone.
George V was an immensely brilliant king, and he gets no credit for this. When you consider that he was one of the few crowned heads still sitting on a throne in 1918 when the war ended, the Habsburgs had gone, the Hohenzollerns had gone, the Romanovs had gone. He was on the winning side, but all through the Great War, when things were going badly, he did everything he could to set an example. but most famously, he gave up strong drink and was very cross. He was asked to do this by Asquith and was very cross to realise that Asquith himself was certainly not giving up strong drink. Um, and he and Queen Mary were always either going to factories. He was going to the Western Front as often as he could to be seen by his troops. He was very badly injured on the Western Front in 1915 when he fell from his horse and his horse rolled on him and broke his pelvis. This was barely reported. They didn't want to make a fuss about it. And by the end of the war, he was seen as a king who had really done his bit to share the privations of his people. He'd had two sons who were of military age in the armed forces. The man who became Edward VIII had served at the front, not as far forward as he wanted to, because they wouldn't let him. And George, the man who became George VI, was in the Navy and fought at Jutland. So the royal family had been seen to be actively doing their bit for the country. And it's why all the way through the 20s, when things were not good, we had a financial depression in the early 1920s that was not much less grave than the one in the early 30s. And it was a very unstable time in Britain, but he was a focus of stability, as was the rest of the royal family. And they all behaved at all times very well. And he was taken for granted, I think.
Well, you point out that his Silver Jubilee in 35 is very widely celebrated, and presents himself and is presented as a steady hand, dutiful, committed to service, concerned with the condition of the poor and the unemployed. And then suddenly, and I think quite unexpectedly, he dies. And suddenly, the way you tell the story, within days of his death, there are people at the top who are quite anxious about the man who is duty bound to take over. They don't think he's up for it.
Well, George V famously said to Stanley Baldwin about a year before he died, talking of his son and heir, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months. And the boy did. I mean, the boy lasted 10 and a half months as king. Queen Mary and Baldwin were both concerned about it. They didn't think he had the right attitude to duty, and they were worried that he didn't have a respectable wife or even a respectable girlfriend, because Mrs. Simpson, whom the Queen knew about and whom the political insiders like Baldwin knew about, was not deemed suitable. And, to cut to the chase, the reason there had to be an abdication was that Baldwin especially had a really good understanding of the monarchy's existence by consent, and he had a really good understanding of the morals of the middle and respectable working class in this country. So he knew that most people in this country would not accept a twice divorced woman as queen, and that it would also, in his view, I think wrongly, affect the king's standing as supreme governor of the Church of England. I mean, we forget that the Church of England was invented in 1534 precisely so a king could marry his mistress. Anyway, the moral tone of England in 1936 was considerably harsher than it had been 400 years earlier. And it was that recognition by Baldwin, and Queen Mary understood it as well, that Edward VIII and his potential wife were not suitable in the eyes of the British people to go forward as a married couple.
Well, I want to go through it a bit more slowly because it's the stages of the abdication crisis are so interesting to me. I think you say, compared to this world of carved mahogany, Edward represented a different kind of Britain, a different kind of international high society as well. Sleek aeroplanes, fancy parties in the south of France, not so much collecting stamps as collecting mistresses, you might say. And those kind of people. Do you think that in itself was a problem just even leaving aside his relationship with Mrs. Simpson, that he just was a different type of man.
Well, his parents didn't like the sort of people he hung out with. That's absolutely apparent. They didn't like his circle of friends. But this was a social problem. In the decade after the Great War, a lot of young people who'd fought in it and survived it decided they were going to have a bloody good time. And if you had the money to have a bloody good time, they went for it. I mean, Edward VIII in the late 20s, or the Prince of Wales as he then was hunting sometimes 5 days a week with smart hunts in Leicestershire, partly because he liked doing it, partly because it got him away from his parents and other royal duties, but also because he liked the women he met out hunting. And it was a pretty mindless thing to do, but it was relatively harmless. George V spent a lot of his time not hunting, although he wasn't a bad horseman when he was younger, but a lot of his time shooting pheasants. And so he was hardly going to criticize his son for country pursuits. But a lot of the people that moved in those circles, they might have been in Leicestershire during the week, but at weekends they were in London cocktail bars and nightclubs and having a good time. And, you know, this is the era of very serious cocaine use among people like that. And there's a form of moral degeneracy that comes in after the Great War, partly as a result of the shock of the Great War, that hasn't really been seen since the 18th century. And the king is aware that his son and heir is participating in that, and they have arguments about it. Um, and of course, in late 28, early 29, the king is very dangerously ill. He has the first of his smoking-related illnesses and very nearly dies. And the Prince of Wales is in Africa at the time on a tour. They send him abroad. They send him to America a few years earlier. They send him around the empire and around foreign countries to keep him busy. And he's brought back because it is believed in November 1928 that George V is going to die. He doesn't die. I think there's a general hope at that stage that, having seen how fragile his father's life is, the Prince of Wales will start to behave a little more assiduously, a little bit better. But actually, it doesn't happen. He does more or less the minimum of the duties that he has to do. And he's, as a young single man, and he's in his mid-30s by this stage, he is going out and playing the field. And when his friends ask him if he'd like to borrow their yacht or go and stay at their villas, he rushes off and does it. And he's not unduly fussy about whose society he keeps.
I mean, I think later in the year when he's forced to make the decision, at some point, I think he says, well, why is it anybody else's business who I love, who I spend my private time with? But I guess if you're if you're raised to be the head of the emblematic family of the nation, your private life is everybody else's business. And that's always been, I think, a tension in the royal family.
Well, it's a tension now with Prince Harry, isn't it? Uh, people, um, uh, I think Prince Harry is a very good comparator, not just because he has a divorced American wife, but they like the status of being royal and all the goodies that come with it. But then they get annoyed that people hold them to account for their privilege. And there was an element of that about Edward VIII. I wouldn't overstate it, though. I think that a lot of the problem he had, and this sounds very unpleasant, and I'm sorry to sound unpleasant, was he wasn't very bright. He really wasn't very clever. And I don't think he could grasp fundamental constitutional issues or fundamental political issues. He was very good at emoting. You know, the day that he or the day that before he sends Mrs. Simpson abroad in November 1936. He's down in South Wales saying something must be done. And that's the sort of thing he was good at. He was good at speaking up for people who didn't have what he had, but he didn't understand the intellectual practicalities of his situation. He didn't understand the business that Baldwin understood brilliantly. Baldwin was not a great prime minister in my view, but he got the abdication absolutely right. He knew the British people would not tolerate it. And he managed to get Attlee as leader of the opposition on side. And there's this crucial moment where he makes it quite clear to the king, well, if you don't abdicate, I'll have to resign, and the leader of the opposition won't form a government, and you won't
Wow.
get a government. The only person who's prepared to form a government is Winston Churchill, who has this romantic vision of leading the King's party. I mean, that really would have been the end of Churchill's career if he'd attempted that. He'd never have recovered from that. And it was bad enough for him. One reason he was taken so unseriously right up until the declaration of war was, well, one of the many reasons was that people remembered how wrong he'd been on at the time of the abdication.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because in recent decades, the idea that Edward's flirtation with the Nazis, his meeting with Hitler, which of course a lot of that happened after the abdication, but there's been a sort of theory that, oh, the establishment knew he was a wrong and he was getting in bed with the Nazis. That's the real reason he was pushed out. But I don't really believe that myself. And I don't suspect you do, because why would Churchill have backed him if that was the case?
I think that's Paul's. He, when he had abdicated, he went and met some leading Nazis, I think out of stupidity and curiosity. And he had a circle of friends, people like Chips Channon, who had been hanging out with the Nazis, not because they wanted to take part in the running of Auschwitz, but because they thought that after the Weimar Republic, which had been a bit of a disaster, Hitler ran a tight ship and knew how to make a country successful. And these are very naive and stupid people who didn't pick up the stone and look very carefully underneath. And of course, there was an incipient anti-Semitism among the upper classes of this country before the Second World War, which doesn't mean to say people wanted actively to persecute Jews, but when they heard of other people doing it, they just thought, well, that's their business. We didn't need to get involved. No, I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that before he abdicated, he was keen on Hitler or thought that Hitler had something to offer this country by way of an example. What I do think was true was when the war was on, he started to get interested in the idea that Hitler, if he were to conquer England, would put him back on the throne. That Hitler wouldn't have all these hang-ups about sexual relations with a divorced woman.
I bet he wouldn't.
I'm sure he wouldn't.
Well, you mentioned, I mean, just going back to the relationship with Mrs. Simpson, you mentioned that Edward wasn't very bright. There's been a suggestion, and you slightly touch on it in your book, that she had a strange kind of psychosexual power over him, that he was maybe slightly submissive to her. He rather enjoyed that role in a relationship, and that's why he couldn't really break from her when it was put to him as an option.
I mean, I knew one or two people who were now dead 20 or 30 years, but when I was younger, I knew people who'd been around in the 30s and who had mixed in his circles. And certainly it was believed that she had astonishing sexual prowess, that she'd allegedly learned, I think, in Shanghai, when married to her first husband, and that she brought these arts, these carnal arts, into their relationship. And, she never wrote about it. And oddly enough, neither did he. So we don't know. We just don't know what happened. She certainly had an astonishing um, power over him. I mean, he'd had this Mistress Frida Dudley Ward for years, who was an extremely attractive woman, and was from the landed gentry in our own country. And if he wanted to have an affair with an attractive divorced woman, she would have, at least she knew the rules. She would have been the ideal person to do it. He would never have been allowed to marry her either because she was divorced. But at least she was a step in the right direction. Um, but there was something about Mrs. Simpson that was so exotic and so compelling to him that he had a form of addiction. And what I've never understood, what I've never known, and you can't know, is whether the coincidence of their relationship reaching a peak just as his father dies, and he suddenly has all these responsibilities, and whether he thinks to himself, oh God, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be King of England. I just want to settle down with my American girlfriend and have a good time for a few years. And I mean, I'm certain if he'd never met her, he would not have liked being king. And I think she did, among other things, provide him with an excuse to get out of that bit of the rat race.
Perhaps there is a parallel you can make with Harry and Meghan, maybe. That
Well,
Harry
possibly,
was perhaps looking for an excuse to get out as well, but I don't know.
yeah, yeah.
But going back to them, one of the things in your book you talk about it's an age of mass communication. There's much more popular entertainment, mass circulation newspapers, newsreels, radio, and yet in Britain, the story of this relationship, which is shaking the establishment, is kept completely from the masses, even though it's in all the foreign papers, and that seems to hold for months, which by our standards seems extraordinary.
Well, that was done to Lord Beaverbrook, who was a friend of the king and who just went round Fleet Street and said, look, we don't write about this. And I mean, the press had always been deferential. There was a breach in that deference in the 1890s, because the then Prince of Wales, who became Edward VII, was behaving so badly. I mean, much to Queen Victoria's horror in 1890, the press reported the Tranby Croft scandal, which ended in a court case for defamation. And the king, the Prince of Wales, had to go and give evidence. It was about a game of baccarat, and baccarat, oddly enough, was illegal in this country. And the press reported this gleefully. I think because one or two people in the press, proprietors and editors, thought that it was a disgusting example for the future king to set. But once that had happened, the royal family were left pretty much alone. I mean, Edward VIII himself had a very baroque private life, as we know. He spent, his 9 years or so as king with Mrs. Keppel at his side. Occasionally turned up to see Queen Alexandra, but he had a mistress and she was more or less full time. This was never reported. It was as if it didn't exist. And Beaverbrook's argument was that he put to the press proprietors was that we were all in this together, that there was no benefit in shaking the foundations of the monarchy by reporting that the king was having an affair with a twice divorced American woman, and that certainly by November that this might have to lead to abdication. And in a way, it worked very well because the British public, most of whom knew nothing about this, went straight from complete ignorance to a completed abdication in 8 or 9 days, and then the matter was closed. So it was probably the best in terms of keeping the public sane. It was probably the best way of doing it. Today, you can imagine it would go on for months.
Yes, it would. It definitely would. I love the way that it's reported in America with a kind of prurient pleasure. I think they call her in a headline, Mrs. Simpson, the King's Mole.
Yes, King's Mole Renoed. in Wolsey's hometown was the famous headline.
Renoed.
Uh,
I love it.
Reno being divorced, because Reno
Being
was the only place
divorced.
to get a divorce in America. And Wolsey's hometown was Ipswich, where her divorce case from poor old Mr. Simpson, who no one remembers Mr. Simpson, but he did behave extremely well throughout. With the king chasing his wife, he seems to have shrugged his shoulders and said, "Well, I can't compete with the king. I better give up." But it happened in Ipswich. Um, but it was the Bishop of Bradford, who was a suffragan bishop, who uh, at a not even in his church, but at a diocesan conference, got up and started to say, "We need a better example from the king." And everybody, the Yorkshire Post reported it. At which point, Fleet Street says, "Well, if it's in the Yorkshire Post, we've got to report it."
And that was
Um,
just 8 days before it ended.
yeah, it was in the papers on the 3rd of December, and the abdication was the 11th.
Wow. Well, as a Yorkshireman, I'm very proud that my home county paper led the way, but extraordinary that it was secret for so long. Behind the scenes, though, there are lots of meetings with the Prime Minister, with all sorts of church figures. Was there ever, do you think, a possibility they could change his mind? Or maybe they didn't want to because they thought he wasn't suitable anyway.
I'm absolutely certain that Baldwin didn't think he was suitable, but I think Baldwin knew his place constitutionally, that this had to be the king's decision, that he couldn't press him to do it. The other person we haven't mentioned yet, who was really trying to get the king out, was his private secretary, Alec Harding,
Hmm.
who um, Alec Harding's father had been Viceroy of India, and he was establishment to his fingertips. And he had taken over in the royal household very soon after George V's death. In fact, I think he had served George V at the end of his life. And he had a very clear idea of how a monarch should behave, and an equally clear idea that this monarch was not behaving in that way. And he kept his mouth shut for a few weeks. But really, from the spring of 1936 onwards, he was talking to Baldwin on Privy Council terms. They were both Privy Councillors, about the difficulties and about the duties that he was neglecting. And what really upset Harding was at the beginning of September 1936, so 3 months before the abdication, uh, the King and Mrs. Simpson go off on a yacht with Duff Cooper and Diana Cooper called the Narlin. It's lent by a rich friend, and they're gadding about the Mediterranean in the autumn of 1936 on this yacht. There are photographs. Nobody comments on what the role of Mrs. Simpson is, but she is photographed on this yacht. And Harding complains that the business of state is not being conducted, that there are dispatch boxes piling up while the king swans around in the Mediterranean and enjoys himself with his mistress. And he puts this to Baldwin very forcibly. The king's friends, people like Chips Channon, call Harding the Black Rat because they decide that he was the man who really stuck the knife in. That's rubbish. Harding did his job, and one part of Harding's job was as a usual channel. And if the king wasn't doing his job properly, the prime minister needed to know about it for constitutional reasons, and it was Harding's job to tell him, and Harding did. I don't think with any great pleasure. I think that there hadn't been an abdication, I think, since 1399 or 1400, and no one quite knew how it worked. And nobody knew before it happened that the transition would be so seamless, and that you'd suddenly have, instead of having a disgruntled bachelor who's chasing unsuitable women, you've got this rather quiet ex-naval officer and his rather genial wife and their two little princess daughters who are a ready-made family on the throne as
Yes,
bachelors.
well, I think I get a sense that, well, you obviously got very little time for the romantic idea that he gave up his crown for love. I think you perhaps regard it as a bullet dodged and we ended up with a better king. And maybe that was consequential given what was about to happen.
Well, we ended up with a better king. We also ended up with the late Queen on the throne for 70 years. I mean, assuming that Edward and Mrs. Simpson never had children and they didn't in their married life, the late Queen would have succeeded her uncle as sovereign, but not until 1972. And so we'd only have had her for 50 years rather than 70. So it was, I think, a bullet dodged. But I think it would be wrong to think that there was a conspiracy to get him off the throne. He was he was offered alternatives. He was offered not just by Baldwin. I mean, his friend said to him, "Look, go along with Baldwin, get crowned, and then when you've been crowned, say, actually, I've got a girlfriend I'm going to marry, and call their bluff." I don't think things would have been any different. I think he'd have had to have abdicated then. Um, but Baldwin tried to make it possible for him to stay by making him see the impossibility of what he wanted to do. And the king just wasn't going to have it. And that leads one to suspect that his heart wasn't in the job anyway, and wouldn't have been in the job even if Mrs. Simpson had existed.
Do you think that the best monarchs are the conservative monarchs? I mean, all the talk we've had over many years about reform and modernizing the royal family, but what people really want is the dull, dutiful, slightly old-fashioned, maybe slightly distant approach. I mean, a lot of people, when the Queen died, spoke of her in those terms, that she'd served the people and she kept her head down.
I think that is what people want. I wouldn't say it's a conservative attitude, because I think you can be quite radical and behave like that. Uh, it's one where the monarch accepts that he or she is in that post by consent, and that the consent of the British people needs to be maintained at all times. And the late Queen was brilliant at this because there was this hysterical moment, which brought, I think, great shame on the media in this country in 1997 when the Diana, Princess of Wales, was killed in a car crash. And the Queen decided to stay at Balmoral rather than come back to London because she had two grieving grandchildren who had lost their mother, and she was trying to do everything she could as a grandmother to fill their mother's place and to help them through this ghastly period in their lives. And then she just gets the tabloid press who don't understand this and who don't understand, they want a flag flown at half-mast on Buckingham Palace, which had just never happened. And okay, eventually they put the half-mast flag up. But the Queen refused to be shaken by this. She knew that the press were trying to whip up trouble for circulation reasons. And within a few years, she was more popular than ever because the most of the public had never left her. If there was animosity, it was towards her son for the marriage going wrong. And now he's king, and he's a very good king. Everybody seems to love him. And they certainly love the Queen Consort, who was depicted as some sort of bonkers scarlet woman 25 years ago. So opinions change, and it's the job of the monarch and his family to ensure that the boat isn't rocked any more than necessary. And if it does get rocked, to try and keep it steady. It's why there's been so little comment from Buckingham Palace on the whole situation with Prince Harry. He's made his bed and must lie on it. And I think that will be the attitude that they take for the foreseeable future.
I'm sure you read Kenneth Rosa's George V biography.
I did.
A long time ago, at the beginning of my career, I interviewed Kenneth about that book.
Yeah.
And he told me a story which I think he at the time said this just proves why people don't want cool monarchs. Apparently, George V and the Queen Mary went to see an exhibition of avant-garde art in Paris, surrounded by ambassadors, diplomats, and lots of famous artists. At one point,
Yes.
the king shouted out, "You'll know the story." Apparently, he said, "Oh, come over here, May. This one will really make you laugh." I just thought, great story about him, but also maybe
Yeah.
about a certain kind of, I'm not afraid to be uncool monarch.
No, well, indeed, indeed. Um, No, I mean George V was a very good king. No monarch really since the Civil War had to confront such a dangerous time for this country. And the Napoleonic Wars were a piece of cake compared with the Great War. Um, and he steered it brilliantly. And he left a legacy which his intended heir probably wouldn't have picked up very well, but the actual heir certainly did pick up well, of how to behave as king. And the late Queen did that, and the present king is doing it as well. So, I mean, Edward VII was not a great example for reasons I've said. And Queen Victoria was self-obsessed and hysterical. Everybody loves the idea of Queen Victoria. Wasn't she a grand old girl sticking around for 63 years as sovereign? Well, that was an accident of chronology. She was not actually a very good queen, because of her. She had no regard for the reverence of the British Constitution at all. And we were very lucky that she didn't cause quite serious damage. In 1880, she tried devilishly hard not to send for Gladstone as Prime Minister, even though he had just won the election. So a whole new sort of monarchy came with George V, and he understood his place in the constitution in a way that neither his grandmother nor his father had, and he set a tone that went right through the 20th century.
Well, final question. Are you a fan of The Crown? Do you watch it?
I was paid to watch 2 series of it by my newspaper. I thought it was abominable.
Okay.
And
Well, I was going to ask you what you thought of their portrayal of the Duke of Windsor.
I didn't see that series, I'm afraid. I watched, I think, the penultimate series and the last one, and I just thought they were terrible. And it really worries me that a lot of people around the world think it was accurate history, which is shocking for our royal family and shocking for our country if they believe that happened. And well, I mean, good luck to the man who made all the money out of it. Uh, he that was a frightfully good financial idea, and it just shows if you don't really care about sort of scruples or principles, or the truth, because there was a lot of invention in the crown, then if your conscience is clear about that, you can make as much money as you like.
Well, I thought it was maybe relevant to what we were talking about because they do a lot about, again, it's after the war when they discover some of the connections that he had with Nazi agents and things. But
Well,
as you say, I don't think that was a factor in 36, whether,
no,
even though it did become one later.
no, I can't comment on that because I haven't seen it.
No. Well, if you want a proper account of this period, here's one of four, not three, one of four. Heavily recommended. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Really appreciate it. All the best, Simon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good old Simon. Properly posh, properly forthright. Great voice. Great kind of old school British voice. And what a story. Yeah, I do recommend his book, about all of them. It's a really cool way to learn about, well, some of the most dramatic decades we've ever seen in this country. And thank you for staying with me and watching that and watching this show. Still can't quite decide. I think next week we'll go with Maureen Callahan on the Kennedys. Partly because the walls of this room are still slightly singed by the vehemence of her accusations and diatribes against the Kennedy family. It's not a book. This is her book about the Kennedys, the Kennedy men, called Ask Not, and it really lifts the lid on the systematic mistreatment of women by all sorts of the Kennedys, from Joe Kennedy through all the sons and indeed more recent members of that tribe. Yeah, scorching and I think properly justified rage. Some of these stories I did not know. I thought I knew a lot about that period. I'm really interested in that period, but Maureen's dug up some amazing stuff. So do come back next week and join me and Maureen to find out all about the Kennedys. In the meantime, thanks for the comments. Keep them coming. Really do appreciate it. Oh, I should say, as he takes a sip of coffee in the Andrew and Phil mug, if you're desperate for a really cool early Christmas present, or there's someone in your life who deserves a scandalous treat, there are now some products in the shop, link in the bio, with just me, and a slightly adjusted logo. So if you want to buy one of those, please do. And if you want to support in any other way, there's lots of options in the bio. Thanks for watching. See you next week. Bye. This has been a Podcast World production. If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandalmongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.